Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. The topic on which I have been requested to share some of my views is, we have titled it as Electricity Sector at Crossroads. For a quick historical overview, which I am sure most of you are fully aware of, and yet it will help us to bring things under context. What was the state of the electricity sector at the time India achieved independence, or even when it became a republic around 1950? The total capacity was very low. Mostly it was coal-based, even at that. And most of the coal mines were operated by the private sector, and particularly these two areas, Jharia and Raniganj. That's where the principal coal mines existed. In fact, if we see the growth of electricity till about 1974, the growth was rather gradual. That is from 1950 to 1974. The growth of the electricity in terms of megawatts production was rather gradual. In the Indian Constitution, electricity occurs in list 3 of the 7th schedule as item number 38. That is, it's in the concurrent list of the Constitution. To build up the electricity infrastructure, under the Electricity Supply Act of 1948, the so-called state electricity boards, they had the mandate to do generation, transmission and distribution, vertically integrated state electricity boards. It was around 1974 or so, 73, 74, when the government of India felt that the pace of growth of the sector, something needs to be done to speed it up. And it is that realization which led to the establishment of NTPC, the National Thermal Power Corporation. In fact, a few months ago, I read an autobiographical book by Mr. D.V. Kapoor. The number of people from NTPC here, they should be able to tell me. Bloom in the Desert, what is the... Bloom in the Desert, right? Yeah. Bloom in the Desert, which is autobiographical kind of account by Mr. D.V. Kapoor, who was the first chairman and managing director of NTPC. And looking back, we all must be proud of the achievements of NTPC. The generation capacity really started growing when the government of India also got into it through this National Thermal Power Corporation. Thereafter, of course, over time, the National Hydel Power Corporation, NHPC, NPCIL. In fact, Dr. Srinivasan was the founder of NPCIL. He was in charge of the Nuclear Power Board, which was set up within the Department of Atomic Energy, and it became NPCIL during the time of Dr. Srinivasan. But the central government getting into generation business, that's a very important milestone. It was part of that the thinking came, instead of transporting coal over long distances, and coal was mostly present in eastern India, and transporting rakes and rakes of coal, as compared to that, it will make much greater sense to transport electricity rather than coal. It is that kind of a thinking which led to why don't we have power plants near coal mines themselves. That certainly gave a fillip. Generation capacities were set up by NTPC, but there was also a requirement for the production of coal to keep up with it. Even at that time, there was a kind of mismatch. The generation capacities were coming up, but the fuel linkage plant was very difficult to come up with the same pace. It was around that time. Of course, coal had been nationalized for different reasons. The main reason being those who are aware of Raniganj, Jharia, etc. You must be aware that the coal mining was being done in a very, very unscientific fashion. Even today, perhaps 65 to 70 places, there is fire raging in the Jharia coal mines. Anybody who goes to Dhanbad, if after sunset you take a jeep or a car and just go around around 20 kilometers from Dhanbad, take a view, you will see fire even today. Large number of fire, somewhat multicolored. Some are yellow, some are bluish, depending on the kind of gases that is also getting burned. So fire continues to be a problem, but very broadly, both fire and subsidence, because most mining was underground mining. The problem of fire and subsidence were ravaging both Jharia and Raniganj. Subsidence was a more important problem in Raniganj, and fire was the more important problem in the Jharia goldfields. But people are living. Also, it is, as all of you are aware, Dhanbad and that region is very thickly populated. The human population is also, literally people are living on top of these coal mines. So those are huge human problem also. I don't know how many of you are aware that till about the end of the 1950s, till 57, 58, coal miners in India were working in these underground mines barefooted. They didn't even have footwear. In fact, a committee had been set up by the Ministry of Labour at that time, called the Miners' Books Committee. That was the name of the committee, and they gave a report, perhaps around 57 or 58, and it was based on the recommendations of the Miners' Book Committee that a compulsion was made now. Underground miners, etc., must be given proper clothing and also footwear. So the point I'm making is coal mining was being done unscientifically. Profit was the main motive. Plus health and safety of the miners were in real poor shape. It was all these things which led to the necessity to nationalize coal mines. And the first set of mines were this Raniganj and Jharia and the so-called Bharat Coking Coal Company was formed. And thereafter, other nationalization took place. But after NTPC came in, to keep pace with the fuel requirements, open cast mining became more popular. Obviously, it is easier to mine open cast than underground. And the gestation period is also reduced. But today there is a situation, like in companies like Coal India, there may be very few people who have seen and experienced underground mining. Of course, there are some old mines which are still operating, but in an organization like Coal India, everybody is used to open cast mining. Open cast mining has its own problems. Number one, the requirement of land goes up enormously. You need land for putting the overburden, and then at the end of the mining, there will be big voids and this overburden mountains. So, in terms of ecology, in terms of the need for rehabilitation of people who are residing in that area, all these problems get magnified in any open cast mining problem. But we have continued the open cast mining. Of course, from a miner's point of view, it will be open cast is so much easier. Even my recovery percentage is higher. In underground, you have to leave at least some pillars, etc. So you can't do full mining. So a miner will be able to justify why open cast mining is so much better than underground mining. But if you see from the point of view of human beings who are to be rehabilitated, from the point of view of ecological damage, from the point of view of all environmental externalities which get committed. Of course, in the early days, environment was never in the consciousness of people. That consciousness first came only around 1972. And in India, in a big way, environmental consciousness comes only after the Bhopal disaster, which 3rd December 1984. But now, as pointed out by Dr. Srinivasan in his talk also, there are a lot of ecological issues. Now, whatever coal is still there available in India, most of it is under dense forests. So there is this, on coal mining, the real dilemma is, how do I take out the coal without cutting down forests? And you know, during the previous government's tenure, the Ministry of Coal themselves came up with an idea, which not many will be aware, and came to the Ministry of Environment, that we have a map of India showing where the coal deposits are, as prepared by CMPDI, the Coal Exploration Organization, which is also part of Coal India now. So can't you tell us in advance, can you tell us in advance, that these are the areas where it's just not possible for you to give environmental clearance, so that it becomes easier in terms of procedurally. It's from that this concept of go and non-go started. Mr. Jairam Ramesh was the Minister of Environment at that time. He did a very simple thing. He had even years before that, we had started the practice of creating forest maps using satellite imagery and through aerial surveys, mostly satellite imagery. So on the same scale of the map of India, in which Coal India had prepared, or the Coal Ministry had prepared, where the coal deposits are, on the same scale, Mr. Jairam Ramesh prepared a forest cover map from satellite imageries, and then said wherever the kind of canopy of trees seen from that is over 40%, let us not destroy it, and we'll call those areas as no-go areas. So go and no-go. But after the superimposition of the coal map of India with the forest cover map of India, it was seen by Coal India that their entire planning, which was a derived planning based on power requirements, that is, coal was never an independent planning. Coal was seen only as a fuel requirement for the power plants. So the entire planning of the country was based on how much power the country needs in the next 5 years, and accordingly how much coal that one requires. So, but with this superimposition, Coal Ministry found that whatever they had planned will not really take place, because what is feasible is perhaps only about 60% of what they had planned. And you know that in the last 5-6 years, there had been a lot of debate on this entire issue of go and no go. Of course, after the new government came, one of the things that has happened is coal production has improved. I think today's production of coal by Coal India is perhaps around 580 million tons. There's been a big improvement in the coal production. But we can't forget that is not sustainable. Depending on the kind of assumptions that you make, how much coal is available, how much of that is really mineable. Everything on the earth is not really mineable. Depending on the assumptions you make, you can say coal will last for 50 years or 200 years or 250 years, all based on two assumptions. What is mineable and the technology available at that time. But one thing is certain, coal is an exhaustible resource. Coal is an exhaustible resource. The immediate problem is, of course, how to trade off between forests and coal. That's a big trade-off issue. The feelings one gets, at least after seeing newspaper reports and whatever comes in the public domain, is that the present government in India is perhaps tilted in favor of development as against in favor of forest cover, even though the right noises are made. That's why perhaps government came down very heavily on this organization called Greenpeace, which had been working vehemently against opening of coal mines. That issue we should keep in mind, because it is not a dead issue. It will keep arising more and more. And this trade-off between forest and coal will occur in the short term. In the short term as well as medium term. There is a greater international pressure to bring down carbon dioxide, to bring down fossil fuels. And we'll be considering in some of the sessions, we have devoted a full session on this, India's nationally determined plan of action, which we have submitted to the United Nations a few weeks ago. So starting on this power journey historically, coal, and there are a lot of problems associated with this coal in the near term and in the medium term, which will also include a lot of international pressure for us to change track in terms of the mix that will be available. But going back to the NTPC story, NTPC is a fantastic organization. Today, whoever is in the private sector in the thermal side also would have been a product of NTPC, so to say. Most of the directors or senior management of the private sector power companies have their NTPC background. So we must congratulate NTPC for this outstanding performance that they've been able to achieve. But even an organization like NTPC needs to re-engineer themselves, keeping in mind this transition that is taking place in the electricity sector. The only announcement that is getting made repeatedly is this target of 175 gigawatts of renewables, out of which 100 gigawatts of solar, 60 gigawatts of wind, and the remaining 15 gigawatts of various other things. What is going to be the impact of this in terms of stranded assets getting created? So, what was appropriate at a particular point of time in this story does not continue to remain appropriate with passage of time. And this has been one of the issues in the electricity sector in a certain continuous basis. Thanks to the Government of India getting into generation, a little later they got into transmission also, with power grid coming in, because it's a concurrent subject to the constitution. But distribution is substantially with the states. Almost 95-96% of the electricity MUs distributed are with the erstwhile state electricity boards, some of which have become DISCOMs after unbundling under the Electricity Act 2003. So you have this fact that distribution, the ultimate consumer, all those responsibilities continue to be that of the state. After the Electricity Act 2003, even though unbundling has happened in a number of states, what has happened is more in form, not in substance. I know Maharashtra well, so I'll give the Maharashtra example, but the story is not very much different in other states. The difference may be of kind, not in terms of, difference may be in degree, not in kind. Like the Maharashtra State Electricity Board got unbundled into 4 companies. Mahagenco, Mahatransco, and Mahadiscom, and a holding company besides these 3 companies. And the holding company chairman is the Minister of Energy. And even though they have been corporatized and are now companies under the Companies Act, the actual functioning is very much like any other government organization. That is because all decisions are taken by the minister, or let us say by the political executive. So the board under the Companies Act, for lack of a better word I have to use, are basically puppet boards. Decisions are taken by the minister, then communicated, then board meetings are held and a rubber stamp is put on all those decisions. For a short while, the Maharashtra companies had a part-time chairman whose job was only to preside over the meetings of the board as and when they occurred. But even that, the state government found it irksome and discontinued that practice when the ministers got to know that questions are being asked in the board on matters which have already been decided by the government. The reason I'm stressing this is, this problem that electricity is a concurrent subject and distribution which is always closer to human beings is with the state, raises an important issue. That important issue is, and I'm sure people working closely in the policy side on this are fully aware of it, the wavelength of thinking of the central government is quite different from the wavelength of thinking of the state government. They are not in sync. But it's hardly stated openly that they are not in sync. So many of the policies, of course, once some kind of policy is decided, there will be a conference of all ministers of energy of all the states in Vigyan Bhavan. The secretaries or this company CMDs would have prepared the speeches for the respective ministers, and those speeches are read out. And the agenda as well as the decisions are already ready with the Government of India Ministry, and that is then, that is consultation with the states is over and you go ahead. And the state's view is, dekha jayega, we'll see when it comes to implementation. There is no commitment for implementation even when policies are framed and a consensus is brought about, a manufactured consensus through this meeting of all the states, energy ministers or chief ministers and the Senate. Now the Electricity Act 2003 came in because even after a lot of improvement in power generation, the government soon realized if you want a 9% sustained annual rate of growth of GDP to cut this vicious cycle of poverty, which is the main problem in the country, you need almost a 10-11% rate of growth, annual rate of growth of electricity. So even with the public sector coming in a big way, much more power is required for national development. It is with that idea that the Electricity Act 2003 came. All of you are aware of its objectives, but one objective was to facilitate investments. That is, over and above whatever the public sector may be investing, over and above whatever budgetary support the Government of India may be giving to the public sector, still more investment is required. So private sector money and private sector investments should come in. And from 2003 to now we are in 2015. So if we see the last 12 years experience, the plus is, yes, the private sector did come in. Today almost 1/3 of the total generating capacity is with the private sector, which was just about 4 to 5% around 2000. So in the last 15 years, private sector has come in a big way in generation, both conventional generation as well as renewable generation. Now with this kind of, so the Electricity Act 2003 was the second milestone after setting up the NTPC, which led to a further growth of generating capacity. And as you know, the Electricity Act 2003 didn't come all at once. It first came with the so-called IPPs. And states like Maharashtra, there was a time when they said, okay, moment Enron is permitted, then the state can slowly withdraw from the power sector because there will be so much of private sector investments. We have nothing to do. And this attitude was there both in the Government of India and in the states. So much so that for a period of about 10 years, public sector investment in this sector came down because the atmosphere was one of, now that private sector has started coming in, they can, you know, immediately after the economic reforms of 1991, one of the mainstream mindset was government should not be in the business of business. So whatever can be done commercially, let the private sector do it. And government should withdraw from as many activities as possible. And the touchstone is, ask the question, can a bankable proposition be made, and can this good or product be produced by the private sector? If the answer is yes, make out a plan so that the government can withdraw from that activity. Let government concentrate on the so-called sovereign functions of the state, which is jail, police, criminal justice system, and the social sectors, that is drinking water, sanitation, nutrition for disadvantaged people. So the so-called roadmap around 1991-92 was government will withdraw, and perhaps in 10-15 years, all that government will need to do is this sovereign functions plus the social sector, health, public education, sanitation, drinking water, etc. Power, etc. will be taken care of through the commercial, on a commercial frame. But what has actually happened? Today, we have a generating capacity of 2,68,000 megawatts, almost 268, or let's take it 270. 270 gigawatts is generating capacity. Even in the last summer, let us say May, June, before the monsoons commenced of 2015, the maximum withdrawal from the grid was about 138 gigawatts. That is as against 268 gigawatts of generation capacity already implemented. The total requirement of electricity on one of the warmest days of towards end of May, beginning June of 2015 was 138 gigawatts. That's about 50% of the capacity that is generated. So there is clearly a problem on the demand side. The Electricity Act 2003 provides for 24/7 power supply. But on ground, there is a demand for power. Why is this happening? Is it really lack of purchasing capacity on the part of people? Is it the subsidy culture where people believe that there's no need to pay? Is it because of perpetually keeping tariffs very low, which used to be very low, and even after the formation of the electricity regulatory commissions, the tariffs have gone up in some states. Each time government of India tries to bail out a DISCOM, they put conditions, one of which will be that tariffs must be progressively increased. Some of it has happened, yet the demand has not picked up much. So there is something on the demand side. Very broadly, if I am the CMD of a DISCOM, of a distribution company, it is what I can call as cash management, which becomes the most important headache for me. I have really no time for anything else. Every month I have to think, will I be able to make sufficient money to pay salaries to all the employees and to buy electricity? While thanks to the first bailout, which was done when Dr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia was in the government, often called the Ahluwalia bailout. Before that, of course, DISCOMs were not even paying NTPC. The central power companies were also not getting paid. But thanks to the Ahluwalia bailout, the central PSUs became comfortable. That is, DISCOMs have to open LCs and the money has to be paid. So now, sitting from the DISCOM's point of view, if I am the CMD of a DISCOM, I have to pay both my central generators and the state generators. Of course, in Maharashtra, Mahagenco does not get paid too much. There's always, at any point of time, 2,000, 3,000 crores of rupees is interest-free loan in effect, because you just hold up bills of the Maharashtra generating station. After all, it's a sister company. So this is one thing that is going on. That is, the DISCOMs are in a perpetual financial stress. A state like Maharashtra is not that bad, because the newspapers will not mention Maharashtra. In fact, Gujarat is showing profit, and after that it will be Maharashtra. But even a state like Maharashtra has a perpetual cash stress problem. So, amongst my consumers, there are paying consumers and non-paying consumers. So why should I? I'm not very enthusiastic to sell electricity to non-paying consumers, unless directed to do so by the state government at particular times, like before elections, or when there are standing crops, and if you don't supply electricity, the standing crops may get very badly affected. Those are the kind of situations when sufficient political pressure develops to sell electricity. Which means, thought of the Electricity Act 2003, that there must be 24/7 power supply, that idea has not creeped in. And how will it creep in if you are under continuous financial stress? The DISCOM. I can again give the Maharashtra example. There are people from MSEDCL sitting here. They can correct me if my figures are wrong. But the idea is to give a broad argument, so to say. Maharashtra DISCOM has an annual revenue requirement, which has to go to the regulator, of the order of about 55,000 crores now. When I was chairman of MERC, it used to be around 52,000 crores. So I presume now it would have become 56,000 crores. That's the annual revenue requirement. Government of Maharashtra gives a direct subsidy for two categories of consumers. One is for agricultural pumping, for the agriculturalists, and second is for the power loom sector. These power loom sectors are concentrated at places like Bhiwandi, Ichalkaranji, Malegaon, etc. About 500 or 600 crores goes as subsidy to them, and about 5,000 crores goes as subsidy to agriculture. So on a broad round figure, around 6,000 crores of direct subsidy is given by Maharashtra to these consumers. They are expected to pay it upfront. The actual system that operates is, government also imposes two kinds of tax in Maharashtra on sale of electricity. One is the tax on sale of electricity, another is the electricity duty. And the agency which collects the electricity duty and tax on sale of electricity are also the DISCOM themselves. And so the arrangement is, they don't actually pay the state government. At the end of the year, there will be a book adjustment. So one can say, we may not be able to reconcile the figures on a day-to-day basis or a month-to-month basis, but very broadly, Government of Maharashtra is paying about 6,000 crores direct subsidy. Over and above that, there is a cross subsidy, which in case of Maharashtra is roughly around 8,000 crores. So 6,000 crores of direct subsidy, 8,000 crores of cross subsidy, which is paid, let us say, by the industrial consumers, commercial consumers, so that the agriculture consumers and the residential consumers can be subsidized. So 8 and 6, 14,000 crores. So out of an annual revenue requirement of 55,000 crores, 14,000 crores is the subsidy involved. Almost 22-23% of the annual revenue requirement. The consumer mix, again in Maharashtra, MSEDCL or Mahadiscom, has broadly about a little over 2 crore consumers. Out of those 2 crore consumers, about 20 to 25,000 consumers contribute 41% of the revenue of MSEDCL. Agriculture sector, for agricultural pumping, in terms of MUs, about 26% of all electricity purchased by MSEDCL goes to the agriculture sector. and assuming that they pay, the collection will contribute about 3% of the total revenue mix. You can go deeper into this issue with a magnifying glass. At least when I was in MERC, I was able to do it because after all, you have access. There continues to be what I call as a asymmetry of information problem between electricity utilities and regulators. The electricity utilities obviously have much more information. They provide information to the regulatory commission, but let's say they provide a sanitized information. That is, they decide what to provide and what to hide back. And you can't keep on questioning because the Electricity Act says within 4 months of a petition coming, you must give the tariff orders. So in this game, you have to survive also. So after asking some questions, you just put that liberal prose. At least by next time you give it, and without full information in hand. Anyway, you finalize your orders. The show must go on. But even with this, one can make broad analysis. I talked about this 6 plus 8, 14,000 crores of subsidy. If I ask the question, where is it going? It's actually going to about 9 districts in Maharashtra. It's basically going to the entire sugarcane belt in the Pune division and Nasik division. The districts of Pune division, the districts of Nasik division and Sholapur. This part of Maharashtra is where 95% of the subsidy goes. Now one sees, which means this sector has a huge political economy associated with it. Even today, in the year 2015, my experience is electricity has still not become a pure commercial good. It is a good of political economy. One of the intentions of the Electricity Act 2003 was to distance the tariff fixation phenomenon from political activity or political interference. That is one area where I'm afraid in no state has that become a pure professional work. The political leadership of the day invariably has a say. And if the regulator does not listen to that say, they have other methods of dealing with it. Because the DISCOM anyway has to listen. It's still a 100% owned state government company. And the reason is obvious. No legislator will like to tax himself. Irrespective of the nature of the government, I'm not talking of political parties, irrespective of which political party is in power, no legislator is going to tax himself. Now, is there a way out? I don't know. The way out is civil society providing more and more information, people waking up, creating counter lobbies. Number one, all these are slow processes. And number two, here's the time for it. Everybody is busy with their own, earning his or her livelihood and looking after their families. So, is this too much of an ideal thinking? So, in fact, if you see the documents before the Electricity Act 2003 became law, one of the important points they provide is it will help to make this tariff fixation a professional activity and it will distance the political masters from this role. Those of you who are from Delhi know that one of the main principal political activities of the Aam Aadmi Party is tariff for electricity. And if people or certain constituents are not happy with the tariff order, they still believe it is the government which can intervene. Nobody wants to go to APTEL and argue a case with lawyers. It costs money, and taking the legal route means always an uncertain decision. It is like tossing a coin, because from APTEL it can go to the Supreme Court, and the current waiting time is 4 years for a Supreme Court hearing really to commence. So if you manage to get a stay, you have literally purchased 4 years of time. So this is one thing we have to remember. The reason I'm giving this background is the Electricity Act 2003 had a number of intentions. One I had stated before was to attract investments, private investments into the sector in all fields, in generation, transmission, distribution, so that the rate of growth of this sector can increase, is not dependent only on public sector investment and government budgetary support. But there were a few other intentions of the Act. The intention was to create markets and to create competition in markets. And any economist, at least textbook economist, will know that competition in the long run is always good. That's the theory. The model of perfect competition in economics is that it leads to allocative efficiency, and both consumers and producers, particularly consumers, will benefit if there is a free competition. So to introduce competition was also one of the aims of the Electricity Act 2003. The first thing is required for introducing competition is you need multiplicity of players. There's nothing called competing with oneself. So there has to be multiplicity of players. And the so-called midwife provided in the 2003 Act to create these new babies called market were two things. One called open access, another called a progressive reduction of cross-subsidy. In fact, open access cannot take place without a progressive reduction of cross-subsidy. Again, these are the two areas. Just as political interference and tariff fixation we have not been able to achieve, that is, do away with. In the same fashion, progressive reduction of cross-subsidy has also not happened. So, open access, the beauty of open access was it is supposed to be a non-discriminatory open access. That is, anybody who wants open access so that he can choose his generator from where he can purchase electricity. What is happening today is discriminatory open access. If you have the right contacts, the right method of approaching the political forces, you make it open access. That is what I will call as discriminatory open access. But there is nothing called non-discriminatory open access. Now suppose I put myself in the shoe of a CMD of a distribution company. Again, if I was CMD of MSEDCL, for example. I told you earlier that about 20,000 consumers give me 40-41% of my revenue. And it is these 20,000 consumers who will want open access. So to be fair, I go to my minister and say, sir, you want these consumers to leave us? Then the state should give us money, because there can be a big political backlash when the tariffs or the poorer people go up. For me, it's a zero-sum game. It's the regulator's duty to first fix my annual revenue requirement. That is first step. And having fixed the annual revenue requirement, after doing whatever due diligence he wants to do, second is he must give me that money through appropriate tariff for various categories of consumers. So it's the duty of the regulator. And if you allow this, a large number of these 20,000 to leave me and seek electricity through open access, then I'm telling you in advance, sir, that the tariffs of agricultural will go up 3 times. Tariffs of residential consumers will go up. If it is residential consumers who are mostly situated in city areas, you may have law and order problems and morchas. And on the agricultural sector, the pressure will be even more of a different kind. State governments also don't have money. Now this has to do with the macroeconomics of India. You see, till the year 1982, the government of India used to have a small amount of revenue surplus. There are 2-3 very simple concepts. One is governments, whether they are state governments or central governments, have 2 budgets. One called a revenue budget The revenue budget on the receipt side indicates the revenue or the receipts of the government. They're either tax revenues or non-tax revenues. Tax revenue being the major constituent. In case of state government, also tax revenues, plus whatever devolution they're getting from the center. That is recently after the present government came into power 15 months ago, they have said that 42% of all taxes collected by the center will go to the states. It was previously 32%. But don't get highly impressed by that. The government has, as you are aware, abolished the Planning Commission and created an organization called the Niti Aayog. But the main difference between the Niti Aayog and the Niti Aayog does everything that the Planning Commission was doing except one. They are no more doing any resource transfer to the states. So now many chief ministers after a few years won't even meet or won't even know who is the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission. Because previously they had to go and beg for money, about which they felt humiliated from the state's point of view. But still they had to go because the state planning is so much dependent on that devolution. What the present government has done is, there is no devolutionary duty anymore with the new Niti Aayog. Whatever money is to go to the states will go from the finance ministry. It is in that context that they have increased from 32% devolution to the states from the kitty of all central taxes. 42% will go to the states. And what is happening to the so-called centrally sponsored schemes, one doesn't fully know. It is still to be worked out.
They're out of it.
They're out of it. They can't abolish everything overnight. Because after all, even the electricity sector, there is some money which is coming as APDRP, RAPDRP, or now it is not the Rajiv Gandhi Gramin Vidyutikaran Yojana, it is the Deen Dayal Upadhyaya Gramin Yojana. All that money is coming to you, perhaps through PFC or REC, the two central agencies who act as. But the point I am making is, till 1980, so this is in the revenue budget of the government. You have a revenue receipt, you have a revenue expenditure. Revenue receipt is this taxes and non-tax revenues. Revenue expenditure is the expenditure incurred for running the show called government. At any point of time, there are jails, there are policemen, there is prisons, judges go, all that involves money. So at any point of time, at a given point of time, running the show of governance requires money. And that is the expenditure on the expenditure side of the revenue budget. So till 1982, the total revenue expenditure was somewhat smaller as compared to the total revenue receipts. But post 1982, the government of India's revenue budget started having deficits. And those deficits continue till today, even now. After 1982, there has not been a single year when the government of India revenue budget has had a surplus. That's called revenue deficit. Of course, that is managed by the central government by borrowing money from the people, or in the final round through the RBI. But the state governments are not that lucky. The RBI controls state finances. Every state has been given what is called a ways and means limit. That is, you can't spend more than this. The account of the consolidated fund of every state, that account is maintained by the RBI, and RBI knows at the end of every day what is the balance with the money availability of each of the states. They can spend more than that balance up to a limit called the ways and means advance. There is an automatic system, a computerized automatic system, where when you are about to approach the ways and means advance limit, you will get a warning. A warning means at least an oral message. The finance secretary of the state will get, no, you're too close to your limit. Please do something. And the moment the finance secretary gets that message, the finance secretary tells the director of accounts and treasuries, except for salaries, all other bills, just hold it up. So a simple method, contractor's bill, except for salaries, don't pay anything. just keep the bills pending. And in the meantime, they try to see how to collect some more revenue. The state PSUs are told, who are making profit, by just declare a bigger dividend, or even without waiting for that, ad hoc give so much money to the state. So the state's finances are as precarious as the DISCOM finances. That's the point I'm trying to make. The state government started having these revenue deficits by about 1988. Reason was obvious, that one must remember that India's development story starts with the Nehru-Moulanabe's model in the 1950s. But there was a deepening of socialism in India during the Indira Gandhi tenure, when there was a huge expansion of government, when the banks were nationalized. And it was so the government's expenditure responsibilities increased as a part of the deepening of socialism, which occurred. Of course, post 1991, attempts are being made to reverse that, but not with very much success. So it's always difficult to cut expenditure. It's easy to issue a notice which goes under the name austerity measures. That will include that people should not travel business class. If a visitor comes to your room, give him tea, but don't take tea yourself. These kinds of do's and don'ts. How much money can you save that way? So the point people in the electricity sector should realize, that it is not merely the state DISCOMs which are under financial stress. The state governments themselves are under financial stress. So it's a kind of a devil in the deep sea. When the CMD of the DISCOM says, you give me money, or I have to get money from the regulator, and the regulator can give you money only after he raises the taxes for agriculture, rather charges, tariffs for agriculture and residential consumers. I'm keeping you advanced and keeping you informed in advance, because the backlash as a politician you have to face. So nobody is able to decide. So they said, let sleeping dogs lie, let business as usual go on. So it is because of this reason that the two concepts of progressive reduction of cross subsidy and open access has hardly worked. Now, in my humble view, this can be orchestrated if there is a real consensus between the Government of India and the state governments with full involvement. Not that one meeting in Vigyan Bhavan where the agenda as well as the decisions are already prepared before the conference. Not that kind of a meeting. A plan of action which is agreeable to the states. Of course, with full knowledge that once such a thing didn't succeed, at least for arriving at a consensus decision. First stage, it is essential to have some kind of a real consensus between the center and the states. Like to give this example, 6,000 crores direct subsidy in Maharashtra, 8,000 crores cross subsidy. Let the government of Maharashtra increase the subsidy, direct subsidy, make it 14,000 crores. No cross subsidy. And then let us taper off the subsidy over the period of the next 10 years. The Government of India participation is, well, since states' budgets are very bad, let there be another negotiation on this. For every 100 rupees the state spends for this, 75 rupees the Government of India will give as a devolution. Unless something like that happens, open access is not going to take place. Progressive reduction of cross subsidy is not going to take place. And it will be business as usual. DISCOMs continue to be under perpetual stress. No state government will allow a DISCOM to die. But they will keep the DISCOMs in an intensive care unit perpetually with a heart and lung machine attached to it and pump in oxygen a few days before death. so that it is still alive. Politicians have this wonderful idea. They like crises also. Or just before, they will let the baby continue and then say, we did it. That's how a second bailout for some of the states is being planned. It will all have the same conditions, the conditions which will never get implemented. You see, in economics, there was a famous book written by Adam Smith, 1776, called The Wealth of Nations, an Enquiry into the Cause of Wealth of Nations. Now, taking the same title, a Swedish economist called Gunnar Myrdal wrote a book called The Asian Drama, an Enquiry into the Cause of Poverty of Nations. So it is in this book called The Asian Drama, which I think came sometime in 1970s sometime, by Swedish Nobel Prize winning economist called Gunnar Myrdal. Now, the book is basically on South Asia. Obviously, the major component is India. What he brings out is that the culture in these countries, there is a peculiar culture that laws are made, but laws are never meant to be implemented. That's what he calls as a soft state. A soft state is a state which is not serious. Even the legislatures, when they pass a law, they are not very serious it's going to get implemented. Also, dekha jayega. When the Electricity Amendment Bill 2014 went to the Standing Committee, and the Standing Committee took meetings in every state, every DISCOM, etc. If you see the recommendations of the Standing Committee, it's small, like cigarette smoking is injurious for health. A small line has been added that these things can be implemented after about 5 years. So I don't know what is going to happen in Parliament, whether it will come also. But even the Standing Committee has given a what you call as a loophole, an escape valve, so that nothing gets implemented. Because states have demanded, we can't do this. Okay, acha, idea acha hai. Let us give us time to think about it. When I was chairman MERC, DISCOMs also used to say the same thing. Where is it written that you must implement it today? Why are you so crazy to implement it? Let 2-3 regulatory commissions happen. Uske baad dekha jayega. So, this is what Gunnar Myrdal calls the soft state. I'm afraid the soft state problem continues. But the trouble with this kind of attitude is nobody becomes serious. It only remains as prose. Though there are difficult but methods of reaching the objective, but it requires financial collaboration between the center and the state. Now what the center is saying, at least as seen from newspaper reports, is now we have increased the devolution to 42%. Now, you look after your problems. As I said, increasing devolution by 42% itself is not completely correct, because you have stopped all devolutions of the Planning Commission. So in terms of total money that the state is receiving, it's not going to be very much great. You have stopped all devolutions of the Planning Commission. Of course, it is true that Planning Commission never existed in the Constitution of India. The Finance Commission exists in the Constitution of India. So in terms of total money being received by states, there's not going to be any great difference. Except states may decide the priorities, which is good. Some of the erstwhile centrally sponsored schemes, a state may decide that I won't implement it because I need that money for something else. So an important point that I'm trying to make is the problems in the sector. There is a legacy problem, a history problem, which should not only be recognized, but an implementable roadmap of how to come out of it over a period of time needs to be worked out. But if this becomes a hostage to politics, or this becomes a hostage to elections going on in some state or the other almost every year, or even if simultaneous elections are held for state and center, at least 5 year, this adjustment process will last more than 5 years. Now, Is our governance system today capable of that kind of cooperation? Even though the Prime Minister has been using this word of cooperative federalism quite a lot in his speech, but in action, of course, I am now no longer in government. I keep track of what is happening only through whatever comes in the public domain. But by reading whatever is in the public domain, I don't see any trace of implementing this cooperative federalism in a real sense. The Electricity Amendment Bill 2014, on which the Standing Committee has given its report, talks about separating carriage and content fully. If you ask the question, what you're trying to do is, you're trying to, let us say, through a magic wand, introduce open access. But this also the government of India tried, the previous government also. A circular was issued to the Ministry of Power, to all regulatory commissions, all states, and a direction was issued to the Ministry of Power to CERC, which has nothing to do with distribution. But the central government could issue a directive because they had powers to issue directive only to CERC, not to the CRCs. Saying that anybody consuming more than 1 megawatt should be deemed to be an open access consumer. The circular was issued on 30th November 2011. Unimplementable order. The central government issued such orders to the state government also, circular, advising the state government, please issue suitable directions to the Electricity Regulatory Commission using your powers under 108 of the Electricity Act. I don't think any state issued any directions. At least in Maharashtra we didn't get any directions. But that circular, the main architect of that circular was a batchmate of mine called Haldia, Gajendra Haldia. Mr. Gajendra Haldia was the advisor to Montek Singh Ahluwalia, and he is the person who drafted that 30th November 2011 circular. Now the new bill takes that forward, and that was only a circular, and circular obviously has a lower legal value as compared to law. So why don't we legislate separating carriage and contents? How do you implement it? Because you see in any direction, the same answer you will get. The answer is, you can have open access only if there is a reduction of cross-subsidy. Cross-subsidy means the industry and commercial people subsidizing other categories of consumers like agriculture and residents. Unless you can reduce cross-subsidy, open access will remain on paper. And the way the Standing Committee has agreed to suggestions which came from various states, idea अच्छा है, 5 साल के बाद देखेंगे. They have already purchased a 5-year reprieve, even if the act goes through Parliament. Parliament, as you know, these things depend on numbers, arithmetics only, and whether some quid pro quo can be established so that the Rajya Sabha actually functions in the coming monsoon session. It may not function if there is no quid pro quo. It may function if some deals are made between the ruling party and the principal opposition parties. This, according to me, is a major problem that the sector is facing. Now, I already talked about, as against 268 gigawatts, only 138 gigawatt being scheduled on one of the warmest days of end May or beginning June of this year. Now, roughly, about 30,000 megawatts of this capacity is stranded. Mostly private sector production units. So at least in the last 15 years, except NTPC, no new greenfield investment is coming in the power sector. People who already invested, some of the plants are getting purchased, etc. Because and the financiers who have equity funds, etc., which are financed, till they get the money back, they are unlikely to give money for fresh investments. Or whenever money is given for fresh investment, with this kind of a background, people are looking for how can I get the money back as quickly as possible. Like 10 years ago when wind came up in a big way, there was this concept of accelerated depreciation, where you could write off your fixed assets in, let us say, 3 years or so. People are happy. So because the man investing or the institution investing or the fund investing is different from the organization which is setting up plants, whether it is private sector or public sector. Only NTPC has its plans because NTPC is a 100% government organization. So they have to carry out whatever the government tells them to. But I don't see any fresh private investment. The answer to all this, of course, the long-term answer the government has found by saying that go renewables. In a state like Maharashtra, the concept is let agricultural pumping be done by decentralized solar generation. For every agriculture pump, you provide a few solar panels, and if possible, a battery to go along with it. Perhaps that's why the Prime Minister visited this Tesla. Tesla, using the same technique which is used in your mobile batteries, have got into the business of making high storage batteries. But how do we reach that stage? At least I am not able to totally comprehend. So that is one of the intentions we said, that in this 3-day conference, we may perhaps be able to, if not find an answer, sensitize so that people are able to work out possible strategies. At the macro level, yes, we are still short of electricity. We need much more, because there is a very close correlation between GDP growth and amount of commercial energy that is produced. So we need much more. But how to, in a sustainable fashion, improve the finances of DISCOMs when you have the social responsibility to provide electricity to everybody? The agriculture story itself is a very complex story. It can be argued in any direction, depending on, again, the assumptions that you make and the amount of history you bring into it. If you take a very long view of history, it is true that Indian cottage manufacturing as well as agriculture got impoverished during 400 years of Western dominance, or during 200 years of British rule, when the main tax through which infrastructure was developed by the British is this tax called the land revenue. So seen from that angle, yes, independent India needs to amend for the way the agriculture sector was dealt with during the colonial era. But even after independence, India has faced a large number of famines before independence. The great one was the Great Bengal famine of 1943 or so. And Professor Amartya Sen has written a book called Poverty and Famines, which analyzes empirical data of all the famines in India. But something similar, that is an extreme food shortage, occurred in India during the mid-60s. 63, 64, 64, 65 and 65, 66. There were 3 years of successive monsoon failure at large parts of the country. Something similar has happened in Marathwada part of Maharashtra, which has faced a 3rd successive drought with monsoon failure this year. But large parts of this country had this monsoon failure, and we didn't have sufficient cereals. Some of you may ask your parents or grandparents. South Indians, for example, became chapati eaters only after about 1965-66. Otherwise, the South Indian staple diet was only rice. Because neither rice nor wheat was available. Finally, famine was prevented by our importing food from the United States of America and paying for it in Indian rupees. Because a few years prior to that, America had passed a legislation popularly called as PL 480. The lesson which we learned in the mid-60s is that unless we have food security, it may be very difficult to sustain even independence. So, starting with that experience, the government introduced a number of policy initiatives, many of which the electricity sector is involved. In fact, obviously, if you want food security, you must bring more land under agriculture. Number two, you must bring more land under irrigated agriculture. That's when the Rural Electrification Corporation of India was set up. Because prior to that, the way you pumped water in villages was two bullocks going round and round with a string of tin buckets hung. How much water can you take out that way? So if you want to exploit groundwater so that agriculture production, more area gets irrigation, is not totally dependent only on monsoon, you need agricultural pumping. So the formation of organizations like the Central Groundwater Board, the state GSDAs, were all came out of the experience coming out of the near famine the country faced in the mid-60s. Persuading agriculturalists to go for agriculture pumping, persuading them to take pump sets at concessional rates, and concessional electricity. In a state like Maharashtra, prior to that, all supply used to be metered. But at the beginning, when there were only in villages, even after all this rural electrification, there may be 10, 12 agricultural pump sets. So around the early 70s, it was seen perhaps the amount of expenses you are incurring to pay the salaries of bill readers or meter readers is not commensurate with the revenue which you're getting. It's from that thinking that this came, why don't we just charge them a flat rate based on horsepower? Let's have a horsepower rate, flat rate. And when it started in a state like Maharashtra, it was 100 rupees. If you have a 3 horsepower machine pump, agricultural pump sets, it was 100 rupees. Now perhaps slowly it has increased to about 600 rupees. Again, in a state like Maharashtra, there are about 36 or 37 lakh agricultural pump sets, out of which about 16 lakh agriculture pump sets are unmetered. In fact, under the Electricity Act 2003, metering is compulsory. So after the Maharashtra Electricity Regulatory Commission was formed, in almost every tariff order, an insistence has been made that you can supply electricity only with meters, and the old cases of unmetered supply should be discontinued and meters provided. Again, that's not getting implemented. I once asked, and once in Maharashtra they tried to implement it, and a very respectable politician, his name is N.D. Patil, and Kolhapur is one of the districts which does a lot of lift irrigation, from taking water from the ground. He organized a big procession where all the meters were taken out, brought in a big procession and handed over to the nearest police station. When did this occur at station? I don't remember the time. But N.D. Patil had organized it. So more recently, that is after I had retired as the chairman MERC, I once bumped into Mr. N.D. Patil, who must now be 84 or 85, perhaps more or less of your age, sir. And when I was sitting alone with him, I asked him, I asked him in Marathi, what is your problem with metering? Then he gave me a story which I didn't know before that. On this flat rate, bills used to go, when meters were introduced, even a few months after that, even 6 months after that, I am told a large number of agriculturalists in those areas received bills based on prior consumption. There are a number of people who had never used agricultural, never lifted water. They also got bills. So the billing system did not keep pace with the installation of meter system, thereby creating a huge mistrust between the DISCOM and the consumers, which continues to be a problem. We are talking of open access, we are talking of separating carriage from content, but even metering, we have not succeeded. I mean, whatever business you are running, even if you are a sabjiwala, nobody will give without weighing the thing. Electricity continues to be one commodity where proper accounting of what is being sold is not being done. Of course, the answer for that is RAPDRP. A short tariff of at least 4 rupees 50 paise, I can still buy coal and sell electricity. But so on the one hand, there was that mismatch. But now today, at least in terms of macro figures, that kind of mismatch is not there for 2 reasons. One is Coal India production has improved a lot in the last 18 months. Number 2, the international price of coal has come down. So many litigants are now not very keen to let it take its own time. At the moment, which means last 18 months or at least last 1 year, the international prices of coal have come down. But in spite of all that, if you generate electricity, you should be able to sell it. So what is happening is, even generators who have a long-term PPA with DISCOMs, as per the long-term PPA, they have to purchase the full power, but many DISCOMs are not purchasing the full power. My friends from NTPC should be able to answer this. My own thesis is, what is happening is, the existing generating stations have the ability to generate more if they fulfill all the PPAs. But the DISCOMs are not scheduling all the power they make. So they are producing, it is that excess power being produced, which is then transacted through the exchanges, the 2 power exchanges, IEX and PXI, which always shows a very low tariff, at least in the rest of India. The tariffs are high in southern India because of the transmission constraints which still exist. So if I open my mobile, I know today's rates. I get a daily message from IEX. Perhaps it is this. So there are too much of market aberrations. The rate, the exchange rate of power is low. Long-term PPAs, the full PPA amount is hardly getting scheduled. That is because DISCOMs, as I said, whatever you do, your principal problem is cash management. So since cash management is the problem, well, instead of purchasing power, reduce power purchase. So it's a kind of a vicious, circle. Yeah, somebody else had a question. Yeah.
I think you have already answered. You told that the maximum demand in a day was hardly 138 gigawatt, and we need to increase the demand. Even in being in Genco, we are not getting the schedules, as you told. The demand, actual demand is there. The actual consumer has a demand. But ultimately, these are the DISCOMs which are not raising the bar, because whatever they purchase electricity, they are incurring losses. So demand is not raised by the DISCOMs. So ultimately, we are not getting the schedule, and actual consumer is having the power cuts. What is the ultimate solution?
So that is what is happening. A DISCOM CMD continuously makes a decision. Is it financially better for me to have load shedding and purchasing? In many cases, he finds load shedding a better operation, a better decision at that point of time. From his point, and his point is, well, cash flow.
That means that the generating station has got the capacity to generate.
Yes.
But they have been asked to lower down the power generation.
Yes.
Whatever issue you have raised, these are well-known issues in the power sector, and we all are facing these issues. But the solution you have provided, like a common man, you have put the onus on the government. So government may provide some solution over the long term, and you have already stated that they have pushed the solution for 5 years back. So if we cannot solve the problem of power sector in the power sector scenario, why cannot we draw parallel from other sectors? like for energy, oil sector is also equally important, and they are doing very well. They raise prices, they lower prices, and oil is used for, I think, even in agriculture, oil is used everywhere in every Indian's life, and it has got larger impact than the electricity, because once the oil price goes up, your daily food bill also rises. So, can we draw some parallels from oil sector, and can we learn something from oil sector to run our power sector more efficiently and more commercially viable?
See, my view is we will have to change our narratives. To give an example, what I mean by change narrative is, let us say the farmers, number one. Number two, even though there are some orders of APTEL, we are still using the average cost of supply. So I'm calculating the average cost of supply by dividing how many MUs we are given. There have been requests, perhaps even a decision after, that you must give voltage-wise tariffs. But people are scared of doing that. That is because the voltage-wise tariff, if you provide scientifically, you will have to give power very cheaply for people who are taking it at 220 kV. You have to give power very cheaply for railways. While the power, by the time that electricity goes to the farmer's end, will show as 22 rupees or 23 rupees a unit. Now that may have to be done in a gradual thing, perhaps like a good example that you gave. Now government is attempting, give up your LPG subsidy voluntarily. Obviously the intention is this campaign may go on for 2-3 years, and if they find that a sizable number, let's say 70-75% of people in the middle class have given up the LPG subsidy, then they will compel the others. Suddenly they will announce one day that now subsidized LPG will not be available. No amount will go into your Aadhaar card or whatever it is. So like that, one must have a plan of action for people to know how much is it really costing them to get that power. Now a generating station knows how much it is costing them. In Delhi, for example, our chairman of the Delhi Electricity Regulatory Commission has just joined us, Mr. Sudhakar. Perhaps he should be able to answer. My general knowledge is NTPC put up a lot of plants around Delhi. I somehow associated with the Commonwealth Games. And one of the problems of Delhi is that they have so many high-cost PPAs, long-term PPAs that have been signed. So Kejriwal is not completely wrong when he says the point is those long-term PPAs were signed between NTPC and the Delhi power companies, Reliance and Tata's, with 49% stake of the state government. Was it done by political coercion or political request? A request coming from a political leadership is quite a strong request. It's very difficult to say no, particularly when you have very powerful people at that point of time. Either the Prime Minister's office or the then Chief Minister of Delhi, Sheila Dikshit, was certainly considered impregnable. Credit needs to be given to her that she could privatize the distribution sector in Delhi. So, but this is, we have tied ourselves into various knots. So how to untie those knots and in what order it should be untied, on that perhaps there isn't that much clarity. That's why I call it under this euphemism. We need to change the narrative. There is a lot of asymmetry of information and how the consumers view the other example often given, I've seen it in conferences. After all, every poor person now has a mobile. Most of them have a prepaid card. And the moment that's over, they go and get it recharged. There isn't any default in payment of mobile bills. Then why are people reluctant to pay a higher tariff for electricity? Take Delhi itself. Delhi, when it was privatized, when DESU was privatized into these 3 companies, 2 of which with Reliance has 51% equity and one with Tata has 51% equity, remaining 49% with the Delhi government. Obviously, it was privatized at a time when distribution losses in Delhi were very high, perhaps over 50%. And the agreement, subject to any correction by Mr. Sudhakar, the agreement was for 5 years there will not be any increase in tariff. Because the private companies can make money by reducing losses. And to the best of my knowledge, the private companies have done well. The distribution losses after these three companies came have been substantially brought down. Perhaps it is, I don't know the current figure, maybe 16 or 17% only. Below that, he says. So which means that is done. But after that 5-year period, for the next 5 or 10 years, why there was no increase in tariff is a big question. Then when there is a sudden increase, that's what is called a tariff shock.
That if companies are allowed to utilize their CSR budget to educate the people of India how much the power is costing to them and what is the real cost of power and what they are losing by not paying that cost of power. Sir, you have used that it is very easy for DISCOM to afford the power cut. When we educate the people that the cost of cutting the power is higher than the political cost, then I think you can push the government, you can push the decision makers, and unless until that awareness among the people is not there, it will be very difficult to come out of this vicious circle.
I agree with that.
You have given examples of mobile companies. They are very much propagating their plans and marketing. I have given you example of oil companies. They are also very much visible, but power companies are very less visible.
You're right. For example, in Mumbai, by and large, people pay their bills, even though the tariffs are very high. That is, in Mumbai, there are 4 distributors in Mumbai and Greater Mumbai together. BEST, which is a municipal organization of the Bombay Municipal Corporation, distributes electricity in the city area from, let us say, Colaba to Mahim. Then in the suburbs, it is Tata's and Reliance, and a small part of the suburb, MSEDCI. So there are 4 distribution companies. There have been protests. The tariffs are quite high. In the BEST area also the tariff is high because the loss they are making on the transport side is being compensated from the electricity side. Because of a Supreme Court order, we are not permitted it. The matter is went the legal thing, and the Supreme Court, even though the main, as I said, once you get an order, the main hearing will take place after 4 years. But the point on Port Mumbai is, even though they complain about high tariffs, people pay the tariff. Distribution loss is quite low, partly because most of the wiring is underground, not open. But it's still, let's say, around Tata area distribution loss maybe 2-3%, Reliance about 9% or so, BEST also 8 or 9%. Not as good as Torrent in Ahmedabad, which is a still lower distribution loss. But the point I'm making in Mumbai is, they know that to pay for electricity. But that is not the same story the moment you go to the rural area. The moment you go even to Pune, that kind of a pattern doesn't exist. Second is, Mumbai you will not find any inverters. Which means, since there was reliable power supply, 24/7 reliable power supply available in Mumbai, within at least the city area, no flat, no residence will have an inverter. In fact, most flats will not have a voltage stabilizer also. You are having your refrigerator, you are having your computer, you are having your washing machine, but neither inverters or voltage stabilizers you will find in houses. While the moment you go even to Thana, outside Mumbai, you will have inverters. Take Delhi, in Ghaziabad every house will have an inverter. In Gurgaon every house will have an inverter. Now the narrative that is required there is, when you are using an inverter, actually you are paying a much higher cost in terms of losses. But from the man's point of view, he is only looking at his comfort. ठीक है बिजली चली गई inverter चालू करो, inverter है. The fact that you are paying much high, you are wasting a lot of electricity, that narrative has not happened. So to that extent, I agree with you. A lot of awareness is required, and the people who are best suited for this awareness are the distribution companies themselves, because they are the people in touch with consumers. This competition of creating retail market, what has happened in some of the Western countries, well, is where the generators have played a major part. For example, in England, there is a wholesale market, there is a retail market. In America, most of the towns, in fact, if you open the local paper, at least one page will be full of advertisements for electricity. Buy from us, and first 500 rupees you don't have to pay. Various kinds of things. Old couples are living, they'll be told that if you buy electricity from us, we will help you with your weekly grocery shopping. That is this kind of where you have separated supply function from the network function. The suppliers are in competition, and that kind of education takes place immediately because they are the people in touch. That is one of the expectations of that amendment bill. But all that will happen only if we cross this first hurdle of open access and progressive reduction of cross subsidy.
Mr. Raju, on this agricultural thing, my perception was that this is...
Can you give him a mic so that others can...
On the agriculture thing, my perception is that there is a very distortion in the whole thing. And the agriculture is in the hands of rich people and politicians.
Yes.
And they never allow this to happen, that subsidy is not given or something like that. I thought some harsh step if someone takes, that we supply the electricity for the rural residential area and stop the electricity supply to the agricultural farms. Let them burn diesel, they are prepared to do this, and they do that, of course. And if someone wants that connection, tell him the rate and then you take that connection. So that may be one way of doing things, because these politicians are the people who are trouble creators, and they never allow. We have the experience of...
to be fair to the politician, at least for a period of about 6 to 8 months, the politicians were very cooperative. In fact, MSCDCL came up with a wonderful scheme, a matrix for load shedding, which was based on feeder wise, which was based on recovery percentage and what is that? Loss. So wherever the loss was high, there will be more load shedding. Wherever the recovery, so it is a matrix creating of 2 parameters: recovery from every feeder and loss in every feeder. If recovery is more and loss is very low, you will get 24/7 power supply. So it was kind of categorized broadly into 6 zones, depending on these 2 factors: the recovery factor in terms of revenue recovery and the distribution loss. So low distribution loss, high recovery means no load shedding, or you will be the last feeder which will face load shedding. On the other hand, low recovery and high distribution loss may end up with 8 to 10 hours of load shedding. And a peculiar thing happened when the previous Chief Minister was in power in Maharashtra. I think Mr. Prithviraj Chavan or Ashok Chavan, one of those periods. Yeah, Ashok Chavan, I think. That is in the city of Nanded. Half the city had power, half the city didn't have. Because one feeder there was too much loss. And at least for 4 or 5 days that was managed. So there have been periods when the politician has been cooperating. But they are forced to give up. In case of Maharashtra, they had to give up when Marathwada faced a severe drought. You see, agriculture is also a very, very risky operation. So the ways you can put pressure has to take into account various times of the year. 1 year is not identical to the next year. Like Punjab, in 1 year, they had almost everybody had open access. The actual reason was Punjab was short of power. So perhaps the Chief Minister called a meeting of industries and said, you all take power through open access, and the state DISCOM's responsibility was to ensure that power goes to agriculture. They were short of generation. So that summer, if you only see the statistics, open access is doing very well. But that same thing was resisted to the DISCOM next year when the generating capacity improved.
Punjab farmers
Are taken by the richest who can afford?
See, the point is, per se, 65, which permits the state to give subsidy to a category of consumers of the choice.
But it's unmetered.
So the reason it is not happening is, of course, in Maharashtra they are giving subsidy for agriculture and power looms. But you're right, agriculture means in effect sugarcane cultivators, who are the rich farmers, who are also the MLAs. The legislature is controlled by them. But the reason they are not able to subsidize is because they are having revenue deficits in the budget. They can't increase the amount. That is the problem. But per se, well, after all, in a democracy, there is nothing wrong if you want to subsidize a certain category of consumers. Like one solution which I have often been propagating, again, a politician will say unimplementable, is the divide Mahadiscom, that is the distribution company, and let them be fully in charge of agriculture and the rural areas, and the regulator will look at their accounts, even if he makes some mistakes, etc., and fix a tariff, and whatever is the loss or the gap between the revenue requirement for running the organization and what is being collected as revenue, let that gap be given as by the state from the budget. The rest of the areas, open it out for competition. Competition can take place in Navi Mumbai, for example. Navi Mumbai, as a zone, perhaps has one of the lowest distribution losses, at least in Maharashtra. Perhaps it is only 2 or 3%. Because Navi Mumbai is occupied by people who believe in paying the bills. Now that area can be privatized. But if you privatize it without making some financial provision for MSCDCL, MSCDCL will resist, or at least tell the state government, this is the kind of thing in revenue, how do you expect me to subsidize the others? So it's in that sense, the responsibility for subsidizing should be squarely taken by the state government. You should not use the DISCOM as a method of their finances to do this subsidy. So whatever you read in the newspapers, 3 lakh crores of losses in DISCOM, actually it is not a loss. The 3 lakh crores is, let us say, an implicit subsidy being given by the state government. It is not transparent. You're doing it through the DISCOM. If you pay up the 3 lakh crores to the DISCOMs, then it's okay. You're not paying that and yet asking them to do it. So if you take it as losses, the DISCOMs get demoralized also. It's actually not a loss. It is a non-budgetary transfer of resources from somebody's pocket to somebody else's pocket. It's political economy functioning. Any other question? Thank you very much.